There is an ancient truth in the game of empires that Washington seems to have completely forgotten. You cannot seize a country's resources and call it liberation. You cannot kidnap a president and call it law enforcement. And you cannot bomb a sovereign nation and expect the rest of the world to applaud your virtue. What the United States just did in Venezuela was not a victory. It was a confession that the American empire has reached the point of desperation where it must abandon all pretense of the rules-based order it spent 80 years building. On January 3, 2026, at approximately 2 a.m. local time, the skies over Caracas erupted. More than 150 American military aircraft thundered across Venezuelan airspace. Explosions rocked the capital. The lights of the city flickered and died as American forces demonstrated what Trump later called a certain expertise we have in disabling critical infrastructure. And within 30 minutes, a ground team extracted Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro and his wife from their fortified compound inside Fuerte Tuna, the nation's largest military complex. By dawn, Maduro was on board the USS Iwime, heading to New York to face charges of narco-terrorism. President Trump stood before the cameras at Mar-a-Lago, declaring it one of the most stunning, effective, and powerful displays of American military might and confidence in American history. He announced that the United States would run the country until further notice. But here is what Trump did not tell you. Here is what the American media conveniently forgot to mention. Just hours before that raid, Maduro was sitting across the table from Chu Xiaoyu, China's special envoy for Latin American affairs. They were reaffirming their strategic partnership. They were talking about oil exports. They were building what Maduro called a multi-polar world of development and peace. The timing was not coincidental. It was a message. And that message was not sent by Washington. It was sent to Washington because what happened in Venezuela is not simply a military operation. It is the final unraveling of the post-World War II order. It is the moment where the United States declared to the world that international law is optional, that sovereignty is negotiable, and that any nation sitting on resources America wants should start looking over their shoulder. But in making this declaration, Washington has handed China its greatest diplomatic victory in the Western Hemisphere. They have validated every argument Beijing has ever made about American hypocrisy, and they have accelerated the collapse of the very financial system that keeps the American economy breathing. Today, we are going to look at what really happened in Venezuela. We are going to expose the oil-soaked mathematics behind this military adventure. We are going to analyze how China positioned itself to benefit regardless of the outcome. And we are going to explain why this tactical triumph may ultimately be remembered as the strategic blunder that broke America's grip on the global South. To understand why this matters, you first need to understand what Venezuela actually represents on the global chessboard. Forget the politics for a moment, forget Maduro, forget the accusations of drug trafficking and election fraud. Look at the geology. Venezuela is sitting on approximately 303 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, according to OPEC's 2025 annual statistical bulletin. That makes it the largest petroleum repository on the planet, larger than Saudi Arabia's 267 billion barrels, larger than Iran, Canada, and Iraq combined. Nearly 18% of all the oil on Earth lies beneath Venezuelan soil. Most of this oil is concentrated in a region called the Orinoco Belt, a massive formation stretching 600 kilometers across the country's central interior. The United States Geological Survey estimates this single region could contain up to 1.4 trillion barrels of heavy crude in total deposits. Even conservative estimates put the recoverable reserves at nearly 400 billion barrels. Now, here is the critical detail that changes everything. Venezuela's oil is not like Saudi Arabia's oil. It is not the light, sweet crude that flows easily and refines cheaply. Venezuela produces heavy, sour crude. It is thick, viscous, and packed with sulfur. It requires specialized refineries to process. It requires expensive infrastructure to extract. And critically, it requires specific machinery that exists in only a handful of places on Earth. The massive refineries along the American Gulf Coast were built 50 years ago specifically to process this type of heavy crude. When the United States talks about energy independence, they conveniently omit this detail. Yes, America produces a massive amount of oil from its shale formations, but that oil is light, sweet crude. The American industrial machine, the refineries that produce diesel and jet fuel, and the essential lubricants of modern logistics, was designed to run on the thick sludge from the Orinoco. For decades, this created a perfect symbiosis. Venezuela pumped, America refined, everyone profited. But then came Hugo Chavez, then came the nationalizations, then came the sanctions, and then came China. The relationship between Beijing and Caracas is not a recent development. It did not emerge as a response to American pressure. It was cultivated deliberately over 2 decades as part of China's grand strategy to secure resource access across the global south. In 2001, Venezuela became the first Hispanic nation to sign a strategic development partnership with China. That was 25 years ago. Since then, the relationship has evolved through multiple phases, from strategic partnership to comprehensive strategic partnership, and finally, to what both nations now call an all-weather strategic partnership. What does that partnership look like in concrete terms? According to data compiled by the Council on Foreign Relations, China has extended nearly $60 billion in state loans to Venezuela since 2005. That is nearly double the amount China has loaned to any other Latin American nation. Most of these loans were structured as oil for financing agreements. Venezuela received the capital it desperately needed. China received guaranteed oil shipments and established a foothold in America's backyard. The China Development Bank and the Export-Import Bank of China became Venezuela's primary lenders when Western institutions slammed the door. They funded infrastructure projects, they built railways, they constructed telecommunications networks. They essentially replaced the role that American capital once played in the region. But the investment was never just about money. It was about positioning. China National Petroleum Corporation, the state-owned energy giant, established joint ventures with Venezuela's state oil company PDVSA. The most significant of these, Petro-Sinventa, was formed in 2008 to develop the extra-heavy crude deposits of the Orinoco Belt. This was not a minor arrangement. This was China securing direct access to the largest oil reserves on the planet. According to recent analysis, approximately 85% of Venezuela's total crude production is now destined for Chinese refineries. China built specialized facilities capable of processing the heavy sulfurous Venezuelan oil that other nations could not handle efficiently. They created the infrastructure, they trained the personnel, they made themselves indispensable. And then in May 2024, China and Venezuela signed an investment protection and promotion agreement. This was not reported widely in Western media, but it was a significant development. It established a formal legal framework protecting Chinese companies operating in Venezuela, ensuring their assets would be safeguarded regardless of political changes. Beijing was preparing for exactly the scenario that just unfolded. When American forces captured Maduro, they walked into a country where China has established deep commercial roots. They seized a leader who hours earlier was meeting with Chinese diplomats to discuss expanded cooperation, and they created a crisis that, regardless of how it resolves, serves Beijing's strategic interests. Consider the immediate aftermath. China's foreign ministry issued a statement describing the operation as deeply shocking and the blatant use of force against a sovereign state. Foreign Ministry spokesman Lin Jian called it a violation of international law, the UN Charter, and basic norms governing relations between nations. China demanded the immediate release of Maduro and his wife, but look past the diplomatic language. Listen to what China did not say. Beijing did not threaten military retaliation. They did not announce sanctions. They did not withdraw their ambassador or sever diplomatic ties. Instead, Chinese officials emphasized their intention to maintain positive communication and cooperation with whoever ends up governing Venezuela. They made clear their commitment to oil exports would not change regardless of how the situation evolves. This is not weakness. This is strategic patience. China understands something that Washington apparently does not. You do not need to control the government to control the resources. You need to control the infrastructure, the shipping lanes, the refining capacity, and the financial relationships that make resource extraction profitable. According to analysts at the Economist Intelligence Unit, China is positioning itself to protect its investments regardless of who sits in Caracas. The billions of dollars in infrastructure they have built over 2 decades does not disappear with a regime change. The joint ventures remain operational. The debt obligations remain in force. The commercial relationship with Venezuelan businesses and military officials persist. Meanwhile, the United States is now stuck managing a country of 30 million people with no clear exit strategy. They have removed Maduro, but his entire government structure remains in place. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez has assumed the presidency. Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez still commands the military. The apparatus of the state has not collapsed. It has simply lost its figurehead. Trump suggested the U.S. would run the country for an indefinite period. But what does that actually mean? It means responsibility for an economy that has contracted by 75% over the past decade. It means managing a nation where hyperinflation destroyed the currency. It means providing electricity, clean water, and basic services to a population that has seen 6 million of its citizens flee abroad. China gets to watch this unfold from a comfortable distance, offering assistance, maintaining relationships, and waiting for the inevitable moment when Washington discovers that occupying a country is far more expensive than invading one. The global reaction to the Venezuela operation reveals something profound about where America now stands in the international order. The coalition that condemned this action was not limited to the usual suspects. It was not simply Russia and China and Iran. It included some of Washington's closest regional partners, Brazil, the largest economy in Latin America, and a nation led by President Lula Silva, issued one of the most forceful condemnations. Lula called the operation an unacceptable line that had been crossed. He warned it represented the first step toward a world of violence, chaos, and instability, where the law of the strongest prevails over multilateralism. He invoked the worst moments of interference in Latin American history, a reference to the brutal US-backed dictatorships that terrorized the continent during the Cold War. Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum was equally direct. She stated that the strikes breached the UN Charter and demanded an immediate end to all acts of aggression. At a January 5th press conference, she delivered a line that will echo through history. The history of Latin America is clear and conclusive. Intervention has never brought democracy. Colombia's president, Gustavo Petro, called it aggression against the sovereignty of Venezuela and of Latin America. Chile's outgoing president, Gabriel Boric, condemned what he described as a violation of an essential pillar of international law. These are not hostile nations. These are democracies. These are countries that trade heavily with the United States. These are leaders who refuse to recognize Maduro's contested 2024 election victory, and yet they united in condemnation of American action. On January 4th, Brazil, Spain, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Uruguay issued a joint statement expressing profound concern and firm rejection the military actions carried out unilaterally in Venezuelan territory. They described Latin America as a zone of peace and warned against any intent for governmental control, administration, or foreign appropriation of natural or strategic resources. That last phrase is critical. They were not defending Maduro. They were warning Washington that seizing Venezuela's oil would be recognized for what it is: imperial theft dressed in the language of liberation. The United Nations Security Council convened on January 5th at the request of China, Colombia, and Russia. Venezuela's representative delivered a statement that framed the stakes clearly. Today, it is not only Venezuela's sovereignty that is at stake, the credibility of international law, the authority of this organization, and the validity of the principle that no state can set itself up as judge, party, and executive of the world order are also at stake. Jeffrey Sachs, the Columbia University economist who briefed the council, cut to the heart of the matter. The issue at stake today is not Venezuela's character. The issue is whether any member state, by force, coercion, or economic strangulation, has the right to determine Venezuela's political future or to exercise control over its affairs. The answer the world is giving with near unanimity is no, and that unanimity is itself a victory for Beijing. For years, China has positioned itself as an alternative to American institutions. Through BRICS, through the Belt and Road Initiative, through the New Development Bank and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, Beijing has been constructing parallel systems that reduce dependence on the dollar-rated financial architecture Washington controls. The Venezuelan crisis has handed China the most powerful validation of this strategy imaginable. Every speech Xi Jinping has ever delivered about American hegemony, every warning Chinese diplomats have issued about the weaponization of finance, every argument Beijing has made about the need for a multipolar world, all of it has just been proven correct in the most dramatic fashion possible. The statistics on de-dollarization tell a story that should terrify American policymakers. According to IMF data, the dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has fallen to 58%, the lowest level since the turn of the millennium. Central banks worldwide added over 1,000 metric tons of gold to their reserves in 2024, the third consecutive year of massive purchases as nations seek alternatives to dollar-denominated assets. China and Russia now conduct most of their bilateral trade in yuan and rubles, bypassing the dollar entirely. Brazil and China signed a yuan real trade settlement agreement. India is purchasing Russian oil in rupees, and perhaps most significantly, Saudi Arabia, the kingdom whose 1974 petrodollar agreement created the architecture of American financial supremacy, has begun accepting yuan for oil sales. The addition of Saudi Arabia, Iran, the UAE, and other major oil producers to the BRICS framework means that the bloc now includes nations responsible for roughly 40% of global petroleum output. If these nations increasingly price their oil in currencies other than dollars, the artificial demand that has propped up American financial dominance begins to evaporate. And what has the United States just demonstrated to every one of these nations? That if you defy Washington, if you dare to price your resources outside the dollar system, American forces might show up in the middle of the night to drag you from your bed. Saudi Arabia is watching. The UAE is watching. Every resource-rich nation in Africa and Asia is watching, and they are all reaching the same conclusion. Holding dollar assets is now a vulnerability, not a strength. American promises of security are conditional on obedience, and the only protection from American power is to build systems that operate outside American reach. China's cross-border interbank payment system now links 4,800 banks across 185 countries. The mBridge project, a central bank digital currency platform involving China, Hong Kong, Saudi Arabia, Thailand, and the UAE, allows immediate settlement in local currencies without touching the American financial system. These are the escape routes that the Global South is rapidly constructing. The Venezuela operation did not slow this exodus, it accelerated it. the tactical brilliance of the military operation itself cannot be denied. American forces suppressed Venezuelan air defenses, consisting of 53 long and medium-range systems, dozens of short-range missiles, and over 440 anti-aircraft guns. They paralyzed ground forces numbering 93,000 troops. They extracted Maduro in under 30 minutes of ground time. Only 7 American service members were injured. It was a technical masterpiece. But military competence is not the same as strategic wisdom. The United States has demonstrated it can capture any leader, anywhere, at any time. It has proven its dominance in kinetic warfare is unmatched, but it has also proven that it no longer cares about international law, about sovereign equality, about the careful diplomatic architecture that kept great power competition from descending into chaos for 80 years. The precedent has been established. A powerful nation can now indict a foreign leader on criminal charges, build up military forces in the region under the guise of counter-narcotics operations, and then launch a full-scale assault to capture that leader for trial in domestic courts. Every norm has been shattered, every line has been crossed, and every nation with resources America wants is now asking the obvious question, are we next? China does not need to say this out loud. They simply need to remain the alternative. They need to continue offering loans without political conditions. They need to maintain investments regardless of who governs. They need to demonstrate that partnership with Beijing does not come with the threat of midnight raids and regime change. The irony is almost too perfect to describe. The United States launched this operation to secure access to Venezuela's oil and counter Chinese influence in the Western Hemisphere. The result will be to confirm every suspicion about American intentions and accelerate the very realignment Washington sought to prevent. Trump told Fox News the operation was partly motivated by claims that Venezuela had stolen oil from American companies during the nationalizations of 2006 and 2007. He demanded Venezuela be made to repay what he described as confiscated infrastructure. He spoke openly about American companies rebuilding Venezuela's crippled oil industry. The scale of that industry's collapse is staggering. At its peak in the late 1990s, Venezuela was producing 3.5 million barrels of oil per day. By 2025, that figure had fallen to roughly 960,000 barrels. Decades of underinvestment, corruption, brain drain, and the cumulative impact of American sanctions have left the infrastructure in ruins. Estimates suggest it would require $180 billion in investment over the next 15 years just to restore production to its former levels. Even maintaining current output would require $50 billion. The refineries are aging, the equipment is failing, the skilled workers have fled. American oil majors are unlikely to commit the capital required for this reconstruction without extraordinary guarantees. They have long memories. They remember the nationalizations. They remember the seizures. And they know that any investment they make could be swept away by the next government that decides to reclaim sovereign control over national resources. Meanwhile, China has already built the relationships, the infrastructure, and the institutional knowledge to operate in Venezuela's challenging environment. Chinese companies did not leave during the sanctions. They adapted. They found workarounds. They demonstrated the patience that American corporations, pressured by quarterly earnings reports and shareholder expectations, simply cannot match. The most likely outcome is not an American renaissance in Venezuelan oil. It is continued dependence on Chinese expertise and Chinese capital, regardless of who sits in the presidential palace. As I record this, Nicolás Maduro sits in a federal detention facility in New York, awaiting trial on charges that carry potential life sentences. His wife remains in custody beside him. The government he led for 13 years continues to function under Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, whom Trump described as essentially willing to do what we think is necessary. but the Venezuelan military remains intact. The intelligence services remain operational. The Chavista political structure that has dominated the nation for a quarter century has not been dismantled. It has simply lost its most prominent figure. International law experts have been unequivocal in their assessment. Jeffrey Robertson, one of the world's foremost human rights lawyers, stated the strike was contrary to Article 2 of the UN Charter, qualifies as a crime of aggression under international law. Professor Alvavera Dominguez Rondo of Kingston University noted there was no evidence whatsoever to support claims of self-defense or UN Security Council authorization that would make the operation legal. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres expressed deep alarm and warned of potential worrying implications for the region. His spokesperson stated clearly that the rules of international law have not been respected. But international law only matters if it is enforced. And who enforces international law against the nation that controls the enforcement mechanisms? This is the question China has been asking for years. This is the question the Global South is now answering by building parallel institutions and alternative systems that do not rely on American goodwill. The lessons of Venezuela will be studied for decades. Military moves will analyze the technical execution of operation. Absolute resolve. Diplomatic schools will examine the unraveling of regional alliances. Economics departments will trace the accelerating collapse of dollary back to this moment when the United States abandoned all pretense of operating within rules. For China, the victory is not in Venezuela itself. It is in the validation of their worldview. It is in the demonstration that American partnership comes with strings attached to chains attached to bombs. It is in the quiet conversations happening right now in capitals from Riyadh to Brasilia to Jakarta, where leaders are reconsidering their assumptions about who they can trust. The United States wanted to isolate Venezuela. Instead, by acting with such brazen disregard for international norms, they have isolated themselves. They have proven that strength without legitimacy is merely violence. They have shown that a nation willing to bomb its way to resources will eventually run out of allies willing to look the other way. China does not need to fire a single shot. They simply need to wait and build and offer an alternative. They have spent 25 years constructing relationships across the global south. They have invested in infrastructure, while America invested in aircraft carriers. They have built bricks, while America built sanctions regimes that pushed nations away. The petrodollar system that has sustained American financial supremacy since 1974 is not dying because of Chinese competition alone. It is dying because the United States has transformed its currency from a neutral medium of exchange into a political weapon and now a literal weapon deployed against any nation that steps out of line. Every nation with oil, with minerals, with strategic resources is now recalculating their exposure to American power. They are asking whether dollar reserves can be frozen, whether their leaders can be indicted, whether their sovereignty means anything at all when American interests are at stake. The answers they are reaching will reshape the 21st century, and those answers favor Beijing. Watch the trade data in the coming months. Watch the currency agreements. Watch the gold purchases. Watch which nations begin pricing their exports in yuan or rupees or local currencies. Watch the Enbridge platform expand. Watch BRICS grow. Do not watch the headlines about military operations and captured dictators. That is the circus they want you to see. Watch the bank vault. Watch who is building the next financial system. Watch who is offering partnership without preconditions. The era of uncontested American dominance did not end on January 3rd, 2026. It has been ending for years. But the operation in Venezuela will be remembered as the moment when the pretense finally collapsed, when the emperor stopped pretending he had clothes, when the rules-based international order was revealed as a mechanism of American control rather than universal principle. China understands this. The Global South understands this. The question is whether Americans understand what their government has done in their name and what it will cost them in the decades ahead. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve can be refilled, the refineries can be maintained, the oil can flow, but trust once destroyed does not return. Legitimacy once abandoned does not rebuild, and an empire that rules only through fear eventually discovers that fear is the least reliable foundation of power. The world is watching and the world is drawing its conclusions. If this breakdown of the Venezuela crisis helped you understand what the mainstream media is not telling you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We are documenting the transition to a multipolar world in real time, and the changes happening now will define the rest of our lives. Share this with someone who needs to see beyond the headlines. And as always, remember that understanding is the first step toward preparation. The old order is dying. The new order is being born. The only question is whether you will understand the world that is coming or be blindsided by it.